Hey, welcome everyone. Welcome along to this Vegan Time Tunnel special. So I've always wanted to put together an archive, a history archive of our movement. And that's essentially what we've got. I think we've got about 37 videos, but some of them are not really up to scratch. And so I've decided to relaunch them in a way, because when you're going live, there's quite a lot of things that can go wrong and interruptions, this kind of stuff. So what I've done is I've taken the originals and I've edited them, re-edited them. I've entered a few more graphics where appropriate, this kind of stuff. And so the idea now is for them to be much quicker, smoother. And so the idea then is that we'll have a new archive of smoother, more professional, if you like, materials to offer to the public, and hopefully vegans will share it around without all the the ums and ahs and all that kind of stuff, because I tend to do that quite a lot. So I've cut most of that out, and just kind of generally kind of sped things up a little bit, and so that's where we're at really. So this is the third one. I've done two already on the pioneers of the vegan social movement, and so these are the two existing vegan time tunnels about Sea Shepherd. And so obviously at the moment I thought it was appropriate, still World Vegan Month, and this is in solidarity of course with Captain Paul Watson. So let me get my eyes back on. Another thing I'll do as well is that once I've got these new smoother videos up, I'll delete the old ones, and so that means that the only thing that will be available is the kind of good list, if you like. So I'm hoping that's going to work. So that's enough from me. Let me just switch to something else and we can start. So welcome along, in fact, to the Vegan Time Tunnel. In terms of the context for this, I kind of got involved with Sea Shepherd in the early years through someone called Dave McCall, who I've mentioned before, and he was, if you like, the prime mover for the Orkney campaign. Now, one interesting thing about Dave McCall was he was the European director of Sea Shepherd, and yet he doesn't feature much now in the history of Sea Shepherd. Don't know why that is, so I'm not going to speculate. I wouldn't say he's being totally invisibilized, but he's certainly, the role he played has been reduced, let's say. I used to run an animal rights shop in Liverpool, so we talk about 1981, 82. He used to, as part of a fundraiser for Sea Shepherd, he had all these cruelty-free vegan products called Corny. I think the brand was called Corny. So it was soaps and shampoos. And I remember neck firming cream. I remember that. And funny enough, it was very popular for some reason. The other connection with Dave was that we were both on the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection Committee, which is why you've got the Brown Dog Affair book there. There will be a time tunnel about the Brown Dog Affair because it's really kind of interesting. It's to do with the statue you can see in the picture there, the statue of the little brown dog. But the reason it links in with Dave McCall is that we were on the committee when the new statue was being talked about and brought into being. So medical students had smashed up the first statue, and then there was a move to return another version of the statue. And then the argument was, because I think it was the BUAV, the NAVS, National Anti-Vivisection Society, and I think maybe Animal Aid, all chipping in. I think the idea was for everybody to chip in £3,000. And this is 1982, so I suppose that's quite a lot of money in those days for this new statue. And every time we went down for our monthly committee meetings, I mean, Dave used to come from Scotland and I used to come from Liverpool. There'd be a big argument about what posture the dog would be in. And eventually Dave lost his temper And he said, I don't care, if the dog is, lying down, having a poo or having a wee or anything, just let's get this done. So he kind of lost his temper about it because he was very much an activist, as you can imagine. And then another context, just to finish the contextualization bit, is the slideshow that I used to run. Now, those of a certain age will know what this picture is, and those not of a certain age probably won't. These are slideshow projectors or slide projectors. So the one on the left is called a carousel one, and the other one is one that you just put in individual, well, you can put in 2 slides at once. So you had to have a pile. So if you've got 20 slides, you have to have a pile 1, 3, 5, 7, etc. And then on the other one, it'd be 2, 4, that kind of thing. So you'd show a slide and then you'd change it, you'd take that one back out and replace it. And the only other problem, which everybody fell foul of, was you had to put the slides in upside down. Otherwise, it would appear upside down on the screen because it inverted. And everybody always got that wrong. So anyway, one of the first bits of activism I ever did, I think Dave McCall must have given me a load of slides, or at least pictures that we had converted into slides. And I used to do this Sea Shepherd slideshow. And it just told the story of the move of Paul Watson from Greenpeace International to founding of Sea Shepherd. Watson was actually thrown out of Greenpeace. There's a history of Sea Shepherd by a pro-whaling organization. And so they call it Sea Shepherd's Violent History. And they say 1977, founding member of Greenpeace International, Paul Watson, expelled from the organization after a campaign against sealing, during which he threw the sealers' clubs and skins into the sea. So if you go to the official Sea Shepherd site, it merely says 1977 April, Paul Watson and Greenpeace part ways. Watson tends to say now that he left Greenpeace, but the story that I was told, that he was expelled, and because he took a happick off a sealer. This is the device by which the seals were clubbed and then hauled across the ice, and so it's called a happick. So he's thrown out of Greenpeace International because they said that was too militant to actually disarm the sealer. And as far as I know, he took one of these things and he threw it down a blowhole in the ice so it couldn't be recovered. And so I think he was also accused of theft. Greenpeace were at the time, I suppose, just establishing itself. And as we know from social movement theory, once you establish yourself, you tend to moderate. So it was probably moderating at the same time as Watson did this particular action, because Watson was a founding member of Greenpeace International as well. So we're up to June 77, and Paul Watson establishes something called Earth Force Environmental Society. This is in Vancouver in Canada. So this is the precursor to the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. In 1978, the first thing he did really in campaign terms outside of Greenpeace International was a campaign in East Africa, which was under the name of Earth Force, investigating elephant poaching and the ivory trade. And so we have Sea Shepherd, who come into fruition really in 1978, September, and the Fund for Animals. If I just zip back to that picture there, you can see Paul Watson. Paul Watson is being held by an unknown human. Paul Watson's the cat. No, it's the other way around. So Paul Watson is the human in this picture, but you'll see on the funnel, Fund for Animals, right? And so they essentially funded the buying of the first Sea Shepherd boat. And really interesting as well, the RSPCA got involved as well, which sounds like an incredibly radical thing for them to do. But the Fund for Animals, the Cleveland Amory, put up the money to purchase a ship. It was a trawler, and their aim was to disrupt the Canadian seal hunt. So by December of that year then, with more money from the RSPCA, as I said, they buy an ex-trawler that becomes Sea Shepherd 1. Now, I think it was Dave McCall who was instrumental in buying Sea Shepherd 1 and Sea Shepherd 2, as far as I remember. I think one may have actually been bought in Glasgow, and I think Sea Shepherd 1 was bought in a place called Hull, which is on the northern east coast of England. So now we're up to March of 79, and Sea Shepherd claimed to be the first ship to go to the ice for the purpose of protecting. And so up until then, I think they were mainly ferried in, essentially, by things like helicopters and everything. So this was the first time that they managed to get a boat through to the ice, and that obviously meant that they had a base then to build on, if you like. The plan was to spray the seals, which became a very popular and common thing that people did. And in fact, that was, yes, the RSPCA, a bit different those days. I think that's what you're saying. So the idea was to spray the seals with indelible ink. It was organic dye, and the idea is to make the pelts commercially worthless. The seals don't stay white like this for many weeks, and so there's just like this kind of couple of week window where all the kind of killing is done. The crew managed to spray about 1,000 seals before they were arrested. And then we get to their first famous actions, which was 1979 at this point. The Sea Shepherd departs from Boston to sail to Bermuda, and there they were set up and equipped to start a campaign to hunt down the infamous whaling vessel, which was called the Sierra. In the 1970s, the Sierra was credited with almost destroying the humpback whale population in the Caribbean. So this is a very bad picture, actually, of the Sierra. The reason the Sierra was regarded as a pirate whaler was that it operated despite an international ban on commercial whaling. Also, the pirates would break all the rules of whaling to the extent that that's important, in the sense that they would take nursing mothers, they would take calves, as well as it were, the ones they were supposed to take. Also, if you see up there the little ramp there, the ramp that goes down from the kind of middle of the boat to the front, that's how the crew get to the harpoon. And the best way to understand that, if you're interested, is there's a scene towards the end of the Star Trek film called The Voyage Home. It's the film number 4 when they go back in time, and that was to save a couple of whales. And so there's a whaler in that which is very similar to this one. So we're now up to July in 79, and the Sea Shepherd find the Sierra in Portuguese waters. A plan is devised. They essentially pack the front of the Sea Shepherd with concrete, and then they ram the Sierra in order to disable the pirate whaler. One interesting thing about these two pictures is the one on the right, you've got all these trademarks from Greenpeace. So even though they threw Watson out, it seems that they weren't too adverse to kind of using his actions for a bit of publicity, which was quite interesting. So the Sierra is damaged. You might be able to see a big kind of gash in the side. And in fact, they said that when they hit the boat and then they parted, with the waves kind of drove them apart, they could see into the bowels, as it were, of the Sierra, and they could see the dead whales who had been stashed in there. So the Sierra limp back into Portugal, to a Portuguese harbour, and the Sea Shepherd surrenders to the Portuguese Navy. So there's worldwide attention on this story at the time. Portuguese authorities ruled that there would be no charges against the Sea Shepherd crew, even though they did attack this pirate whaler. By the time we get to November 79, that the Sierra is being repaired. It's been repaired at the dockside in order to return to the sea. At the same time, the Sea Shepherd boat is confiscated. One part of the story, although this is kind of disputed now, I think in the official history, is that the idea was to give the Sea Shepherd to the whaling company, which was called the Sierra Trading Company, as compensation for the damage and the loss of income caused by the ramming. The official Sea Shepherd story says that the Portuguese judge in the case had been bribed in order to make that decision to hand over Sea Shepherd's boat. So on New Year's Eve of 1979, the Sea Shepherd is sunk by being scuttled, which basically means going into the lower part of the boat and releasing the valves to let the water in. And so their own crew essentially scuttled their own boat in order to prevent it from being given to the whalers. The official version says that Captain Paul Watson and Chief Engineer Peter Wooffe, great name, Peter Wooffe, scuttled the Sea Shepherd. By the time we get to 1980, the Sierra is refitted and ready to return to the oceans. And so then some action is taken. And again, the Sea Shepherd official account says that 2 men and a woman enter the black waters of Lisbon Harbour during the dead of night on February the 6th, 1980. The Sierra is scuttled without injuries to her crew, and the career of the world's most ruthless illegal whaling ship is permanently brought to an end. By the time we get to March of 1980, to prevent the Sea Shepherd returning to the seal hunt in 1980 from 1979, Watson is ordered into prison on the actual first day of this new seal hunt. So they kind of convicted him, but then held the sentence over for a year to make sure that it'd be in custody when the new seal hunt would start. So essentially, his action from the previous year was used against him to stop him doing any action in 1980. By the time we get to April, on April the 28th, the pirate ships, which were called Ibsa 1 and Ibsa 2, they are sunk in a place called Vigo, which is in Spain. And at the same time, Sea Shepherd post reward posters all over the waterfront in the Canary Islands, which was offering a 25,000 bounty on another pirate whaler called the Astrid. And so the Astrid's owners refused to sail the vessel and actually retired the vessel. Now, the interesting part about that is the fact that they were unsure that they could get a reliable crew. First of all, they might not get a crew because they were frightened of the idea that they would be sunk, and also some of the crew might be the very people themselves who were there determined to. Sierra, was the Sierra operating illegally though? Yes, it was known as a pirate whaler, and that meant that it was illegal for the reasons that I gave. So it was kind of operating in times when it shouldn't, and it was also taking the types of whales that none of the whalers are supposed to do. So the Sea Shepherd was penalized for doing the job that should have been done by the authorities. Yes, in fact, that was played on very much by Watson in later years, because he actually said he would approach a whaling boat and say, right, we are Sea Shepherd, we're ourselves pirates of the ocean, but you are illegal, so return to base. We're not the ones who are illegal, you are the ones who are illegal. And so there's quite a lot of because there was a big series about Sea Shepherd called Whale Wars, and there's, I think, quite a lot of cases where Watson would order the other side, as it were, to return to base on the grounds that Sea Shepherd was upholding the law and the whalers weren't, as it were. Okay, so we're up to September 1980, and the South African Navy sink 2 boats, the Susan and the Teresa. These are the property of the owners of the Sierras. By the time we get to 1980, the end of, all illegal whaling operation in the Atlantic had ceased. Exactly what happened in the ensuing years, I'm not quite sure about. My kind of knowledge of Sea Shepherd is really limited to these early years. So whether it resumed again or what, I'm not actually quite sure. We would have to investigate that together. We'd have to get our Google sticks out to do that. In October 1980, movie rights were sold to Warner Brothers to raise money to purchase another trawler in Britain. So the fishing trawler called St. Giles is bought and renamed Sea Shepherd 2. How do you set up a trading company if the activities are, well, that's the thing. It's some of it isn't. It wasn't illegal to have a whaling trading company. It's just that if some of your boats were doing illegal things. So in terms of the job of the authorities, it's very difficult. If you just imagine their difficulty of actually regulating the atrocity of whaling when you're talking about they could be anywhere in the world. And so that's one of the I've watched Whale Wars. It was broadcasted on Animal Planet. Yes, that's right. It's all a bit daring do, but I suppose they had to cater for the kind of drama of that kind of series, I suppose. Well was I think about 5 years ago, Joanna. I'm not quite sure when it was, but I think about 5 years ago when that was big news. So we've got the new Sea Shepherd 2, and the vessel is moved from Hull to Greenock in Scotland for repairs and refit. The official history suggests that the sale of the film rights was enough to buy Sea Shepherd 2, but fundraising was also involved, and especially from the British end of it. True, but I mean in regards to the demand, was that all black market? Well, it'd have been a mixture, that's what I'm saying, in the sense that, some of their catches would be legal, presumably, and some of them not. But the authorities kind of catching them with illegal whales, and again, I suppose it's a question of how do you tell, depending on the size of the whales taken. They might have been too young officially, but they might have been a similar size to the ones that they were allowed to take. I imagine it got very difficult to regulate that type of thing, like it is to regulate any type of animal use. I mean, even the ones on the land, in a farm setting, are difficult to regulate, as we know, because of all this high welfare nonsense that is exposed time and time again, even though half the time it was the animal groups that wanted to bring it in the first place. And then 5 years down the line, they're exposing the thing that they brought in themselves. So, but, to actually regulate all that at sea, as it were, and then presumably catching them once they dock as well might be a problem. And again, I don't know really, back in those days, it could well be that the regulation about tracking them might have been different. And you could imagine now with all the satellite technology, I mean, you can even find this on the internet if you want. You can find out where all the boats are in the same way as you can find out where all the planes are. I don't suppose that technology was even available back in the day. So as I said, the official history says that the film rights were enough to buy the new boat. As far as I know, there was no film in the end. So whether they had to give the money back, I'm not quite sure. But in terms of the European branch, they did things like releasing this particular single, which I've got in my hot little sticky hands, if you can see that. So that's the single. It's on the Animus record label, which produced quite a lot of animal related things. So this is Country Joe MacDonald, famous for his anti-Vietnam War song in Woodstock, of course. And it's interesting. On the back, he says, "Without our help, they will soon become extinct, the baby seals. You are a very important person to a baby seal. I wrote the song, but only you can play it." So that was a big deal. So we used to sell this in the shop, and it was also part of, if you can see that there was an album as well called Animal Tracks. It was all part of that. These kind of vinyl records were used quite a lot back in the day to fundraise. So it's called Blood on the Ice. The B-side is called Coyote, which is really good. If you want to listen to that, it's a great song. There is like a studio version, but there's also a live version. So if you go onto YouTube and put in Country Joe MacDonald Coyote, you'll get it. But if you get the chance, go for the live one, because it's better than the studio one. There's a kind of Irish version of Desert Island Discs, and I was on that once, and I chose that as one of my records. So it's a goodie, in other words. It's a goodie. Now, one interesting thing from the movement point of view is this, that in 2010, I was involved in this group called AR Zone, Animal Rights Zone, and we used to have interviews and chats. And this was really before everything was on video. So we used to do these kind of text chats, and then we moved to audio podcasts and this kind of stuff. And the founder of AR Zone is called Carolyn Bailey, and she was very concerned about sea life. She was quite matey, really, with Paul Watson. And so Watson actually requested to come on to AR Zone to do an interview. The reason for it was quite interesting. He came on because he wanted to say to the movement that Sea Shepherd wasn't an animal rights group, which might strike some people as odd, but he wanted to underline the fact that it was a conservation society. He actually said, just look at the name, Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. So it's a marine conservation group. Then in 2017, in other words, 7 years later from this interview, he did another one in something called the Martin Executive, where he basically said the same thing. So this is the part of that, which is the 10 misconceptions about Sea Shepherd. And so Paul Watson was asked, is Sea Shepherd an animal rights organization? And Paul replied, some media describe Sea Shepherd as an animal rights organization. However, Sea Shepherd is not an animal rights organization. Sea Shepherd is a marine conservation organization specializing in anti-poaching activities. So going back to your question, Andy, that's what they began to call themselves, anti-poaching, and even pirates and that kind of stuff, but kind of good pirates, I suppose. This misconception may be because all Sea Shepherd ships are 100% vegan vessels. So there's some confusion here from Paul Watson in the sense that what it really means is that the Sea Shepherd ships were 100% plant-based. If they really were 100% vegan vessels, then it would be an animal rights organization, but they weren't. And also, I think the rule about being plant-based was only relevant to when you're actually a crew member, actually on board at sea, as it were. They are vegan vessels for conservation and environmental reasons. And what Paul Watson would often say is the fact that they became plant-based on the grounds that so-called cattle, so-called livestock, were starting to become one of the major predators of the sea because fish meal was starting to be used as so-called livestock feed. And so it was on that grounds that Sea Shepherd became plant-based, not, as it were, animal rights grounds. In fact, if I just switch to this is my blog on human relations with other sentient beings. And so this is from 2015. I appeared twice on this State of the Oceans radio show. It was a very bizarre experience. And if you go to the blog and listen to it, you'll see it was very, very, very chaotic. It was the Barbie twins and Paul Watson, and then I was on there as well. And essentially, I was talking about vegan philosophy, and I was talking about the research that suggests that people who are health vegans often drop out, and people who are environmental vegans, which in the kind of vernacular, if you like, that's what Sea Shepherd are, environmental vegans, or really plant-based for environmental reasons, right? So they often drop out as well. And so Paul wasn't too happy with this research and the empirical evidence that I was giving him. And he said, well, the other animals don't care why somebody doesn't eat them. And I said, yes, that is true, but it's not, it's irrelevant to the point. The research suggests that it's the so-called ethical vegans. And of course, as we know, ethical vegans means code for vegan, right? And so it's the ethical vegans who remain vegan. That's what the research suggests. So that was my experience with the last experience I had with Paul Watson back in 2015. Yeah, so we're into Save the Seal territory, and we're talking about the Orkney Islands. Now, sometimes people don't know where that is, and so this is a map to show you about that. So we talked about the north of Scotland. So the Orkneys are the circled bunch of islands in that one on the left there, and it's in between the mainland Scotland and the Shetland Islands. And then this picture on the second picture really is the actual Orkney Islands themselves. There's quite a conglomeration of different islands, as you can see. The main one in the middle is called the mainland. Kirkwall is the capital. So if you see all the ones that are kind of, as it were, to the north or above Kirkwall, that's where the actual seals were being killed, and that's where we sail to from the mainland. So that's where it all kind of happened. So that's the kind of geography of the situation. So this story involves Sea Shepherd, or Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. and also the Hunt Saboteurs, and also Greenpeace International, not to be confused with Greenpeace London. Now, I always say that. I don't know if they've ever been confused, but I always say it anyway. So maybe if they've never been confused, it's because of me. But we're talking about Greenpeace International, you know, the famous conservation group, in other words. So setting the scene for us then is a newspaper called the Orcadian. Reports that the seal population had increased around the Orkneys from the end of the Second World War. There's some speculation about why the population increased. I think, although just speculation really, is I think it might have increased because of the war itself. In other words, seals who were located further south around Britain were driven north by the bombing. And also, and this came up with in COVID really, it was reported that the whales were thriving because there was less boats in the sea, and their screws, you know, the propeller, create a lot of turbulence and noise. And so if you can imagine wartime, it must have been really bad because there's been a big increase in submarines, for example. And so the chances are that the seals were driven north from around Britain, and they found themselves in the Orkney Islands. And presumably, once they found a safe place and a quiet place, they stayed. So this Orcadian article is talking about the so-called seal wars of the 1970s and very early 80s. And so because of this population increase, then the Scottish Office started to issue licenses to kill a number of seals every year. And usually it was about 1,000 to 2,000 individuals. But then in 1978, there's a crunch year because the Scottish Office really increased the numbers of licenses. We got reports that we were talking about maybe 6,000 rather than 1,000 or 2,000. And according to this report, it says there's going to be 900 mothers killed and 4,000 seal pups. What seems to have encouraged Greenpeace to become involved was this kind of close to 6,000 seal kill. Other people got involved because of the publicity that was caused by all this. Brigitte Bardot, the right-wing actress, was involved. And at the time, the Orkney MP, Member of Parliament, was called Joe Grimmond. And he received a petition signed by over 6,000 people. But that was 6,000 people from within the Orkney Islands themselves, which is pretty good. And he also received 118 letters of protest from within the islands as well. That's a pretty good percentage. There were about 18,000 humans at the time living in the Orkney Islands. Nowadays, it's more like 22,000, maybe 25,000 by now. So if you see the insert there, the bit to the right, it says that 100 journalists had descended on the islands in 1978, which is quite a lot of people to accommodate, as you can imagine, on these small islands. And Grimmond says that all told, he received 2,787 letters about the seals, and all but 7 of those people opposed the kill. So it had become quite an international story, really, and involved Greenpeace, as I said. Then there's a little mention at the bottom of your little insert there about Margaret Thatcher. And it says this: former Prime Minister once said that during her tenure at Downing Street, the welfare of seals was the most common topic raised in her postbag. I suppose you could say this is animal-loving Britain, I suppose. Were they being killed for food? No, they were just being killed. In fact, I'll tell you the story about why they were being killed in a few minutes, but they weren't killed for food. They were killed to reduce the population. Whether anyone actually then went on to eat them, I'm not totally sure about that, but that wasn't the primary reason for it. So this here is a journalist called John Craven, and he used to have this children's program which was called John Craven's News Round, and that covered the story in 1978. I think I was living in outer London at the time, and I saw this broadcast. Yeah, I think the fishermen claim they eat their income. Yeah, that's what I'm just about to tell you. So what I remember is during the report, a fisher person in the Orkneys said that the seals were eating our fish, as he put it. And that struck me as rather odd. And I was thinking, well, doesn't that really mean that the seals got to the fishers before you did? And so that always struck me as unfair and unjust. And so that started my journey to veganism, really. And so I started to boycott the flesh of fishers while still eating other types of animal flesh, which obviously didn't make sense. So within about 3 months of doing that, I was a fully fledged vegan. Interesting. When I think about my first few months of veganism, maybe I was plant-based. It's hard to know when the full philosophy of veganism sinks in a way. So that was kind of my story. It was created by this controversy about the seals. This is the BBC talking about it. It reports on the involvement of Greenpeace, as you can see, and there's 2 pictures of the Rainbow Warrior in there. The picture on the right, tagged The Guardian, that's actually the Rainbow Warrior after it had been sunk. It had been blown up by the French government and their secret service, and this was 1985. One person, a photographer, was murdered in the attack, and he actually drowned because he'd gone back into the sinking boat to try and recover his cameras. Other crew members were blasted into the water by a second explosion, so it was a kind of big deal, especially because it involved the French government. It was a scandal, really, and resulted in resignation of the French defense minister, who was called Charles Arnoux. 2 French agents pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and they became sentenced to 10 years in prison. This won't surprise you too much. They spent little over 2 years in a prison on the Polynesian island, and then they were released by the French government. So that's the way that those things usually work. So this BBC report failed to mention that the hunt saboteurs were there, but they were actually there. So this is what created the involvement of Sea Shepherd, because the Scottish office at this point, in fact, the headline here, grey seal cull dramatically reduced, the Scottish office backed down. So they go back to the idea of the original 2000 kill. And Greenpeace, being a conservation group rather than an animal rights group, they declared that to be a victory. So they opened up their champagne and essentially they sailed off, leaving the SABs to say, well, what about the 2000 who are going to be killed anyway? The BBC said this, only just 2,000 seals will now be killed, 2,300 less than originally planned. To paint a little bit more of a picture, I'm going to show you a video. Now, the first part of this video was from 1978, the year in question, as it were, when the big increase started. And then the second part was uploaded in 2018. The interesting part of the second part is that it shows that the problem of the seals and the sealers and the killers had remained, but for a different reason, which was fish farming. And also the report mentions shooting. So that's one difference between what goes on in the Orkneys and in Britain, for example. They shoot the seals, whereas obviously if you think about the Canadian kill in Newfoundland, then you're talking about the clubbing of seals. So it is a bit different in that sense.
Well, if the cull were not to take place, I would say that the future looks very bleak for a big percentage of the fishermen around Orkney.
They might have to give up?
In the long term, if the seals continue to multiply as they're doing and nothing's done about it, it's fairly obvious they'll have to give up because there's no alternate fishing for them to go to.
We don't know enough about just what effect the cull will have on the shellfish industry. After all, these seals do eat the predators of lobsters and crabs.
And so they could be an advantage to the shellfish industry?
In my opinion, I think there's a considerable advantage in maintaining the seal population, certainly on the scale it has been in the past, unless there's some evidence to show otherwise. I'm not at all happy that it is necessary to kill such a large number of seals.
And here you can see the Greenpeace Warrior flagship, Rainbow Warrior there.
Scotland is a good place for both common and grey seals due to the wild and remote coastline, which provides safe places to haul ashore and to breed with nearby rich foraging grounds. With more than 250 salmon farm sites in Scotland and a seemingly endless supply of what would be natural seal food, it's not surprising there is an issue of conflict.
The Marine Scotland Act was put in place in 2010 to ensure the protection of our seals and to enforce appropriate management of seals here in the UK. So the shooting of seals is something that is happening here in the UK and is licensed. This licensing to shoot seals has been put in place to protect the fish and to reduce the damage to farms.
Salmon farms are an important industry for Scotland, but the good news is that it is possible for them to coexist alongside seals without the loss of fish or shooting of seals. There are a variety of methods that can be employed to protect seals. One of the most commonly used is ADDs, or acoustic deterrent devices. They make painfully loud underwater noises which the salmon farms use to keep the seals away from their salmon pens. I met up with David Ainsley, who's been looking into the use of ADDs by salmon farms in Scotland and their effect on seals and other wildlife.
They're not particularly good at keeping seals and salmon separated because the seals can either be eventually deafened by the ADDs or they keep their heads above the water so that the ADDs are not effective. And seals can learn that the noise from the ADDs is a dinner bell showing them where the fish farms are and where the food is.
Really? Okay, so it's almost like the opposite effect.
This is the Greenpeace statement. They declared victory, and then Wilkinson, who is the director, said, "We've always said that there's a case for culling the seals, but evidence has simply not been made available." So essentially, Greenpeace was saying it was the size of the cull which was the issue for them, rather than the cull itself. And so this is why the Orkney campaign transferred to Sea Shepherd, or the European version of Sea Shepherd, and also the Hunt Saboteur. So rather than Greenpeace and the SABs, it ended up being Sea Shepherd and the SABs. So Sea Shepherd Europe was based in Glasgow, and the European director was this guy here, Dave McCall. Now, the interesting thing about Dave is that he's almost been totally erased from Sea Shepherd history. And there is a possibility that he may have fallen out with Paul Watson, but I don't know that for certain. But certainly if you look at Sea Shepherd history, either online or in books, for example, you don't get a lot about Dave McCall, although he was the prime mover in this particular thing. So he organised the sabotage of a kill in 81, and the Merseyside Sea Shepherd joined that campaign, and I was kind of affiliated with that at the time. The prime mover of Merseyside Sea Shepherd was somebody called Kevin Lee, and we're going to meet him again in some press coverage a little later on. So we'd moved from the late 70s into the 80s, and then we had to start some kind of training. This is a Sea Rider, my favorite type of boat. So it's a semi-inflatable speedboat, essentially. So this is what we would mainly be using in the Orkneys. And so Kevin Lee had bought one, and then it was a question of us getting used to them and getting used to launching them in particular. Now, that was interesting in the sense that we would go to, on a stormy day, we would go to the Wirral, which is near Liverpool, where there's strong winds and high tides, and we would try to launch the boats into the water. And the locals would come down and they would say, "Do you know, there's a jetty just up there, and you could just wheel the thing into the water." So we had to explain, well, yeah, but the idea which we're training for an operation here, so that's why we're deliberately going into the rough sea. So it turned out that I got quite good at kind of walking backwards into the sea with the boat, you know, up here, as it were, and wait for a big wave, and I would push the boat upwards, and so the bottom of the boat would be hit by a wave, and then it would go over it, and then they would drag me into the Sea Rider. And so we ended up being pretty good at launching into really rough seas, which we knew we would have to do once we got to the Orkneys, because we were going to be going to a lot of uninhabited islands where there was no facilities for. Same nonsense in Ireland in 2020 down in Kerry. The poor old fishermen had their livelihoods impacted by all the aggressive seal monsters. Yes, in fact, a year after this, the SABs who took part in the Orkneys went to Mayo because there was a seal cull in Ireland. So that must have been 83, I think, because I'd opened the first animal rights shop in Britain at the time. So I stayed to keep that going while most of the people in this story went over to Ireland the following year. So the Merseyside people they claimed that they were concerned that the seals would attack you. Yes, of course they would. They'd come steaming out and rush into all the playgrounds and have a real go at the kids. Yes, of course they would. So the Sea Shepherd Merseyside people arrive in Glasgow, mainly the SABs there, but that's where the Sea Shepherd were based as well. And we were told the great plan of action, and there was two parts to it. The first one meant that the idea was to surround the killers who had the gun and keep knocking the barrel of the gun into the air so he couldn't point it at the seals. And then part two, or the second part, plan B, was to spray the seals to make them commercially unvaluable. So that answers Deb's question in the sense that I think they were selling the pelts as well as just killing them. So there is that. It's interesting though, because we saw, as we were sailing past some of the islands, we saw them shooting, and the effect of the gun would be that the seal pup would roll off a cliff. And of course, then they wouldn't be counted in the cull or the kill. So in that sense, there was probably always more killed than were licensed for, because they obviously would just arrive with the right amount, but they'd kill loads of them who'd ended up in the sea. We ended up going to the Orkneys, and this is some of the press that resulted a year later, really. I'm going to put this on full screen so I can give you a flavour of what's going on. It says, Farah seal cull confrontation, protesters fined. So I'm just going to read you most of the first column and some of the third one, really. 7 Sea Shepherd seal cull protesters who were arrested on North Farah in November last year appeared for trial at Kirkwall Sheriff Court on Tuesday after denying charge of assault and breach of the peace. Mr. Marcus Hewitt, farmer, Scal Cottage, Westray, told the court that he and Mr. John Hercus, I think it is, Hercus, Gretna Green, Westray, had licensed to cull 250 grey seal pups during the annual seal cull. Mr. Hewison said that he was aware that a group of protesters had arrived on the island, and so he asked for a police presence on the island when he got there to do the kill. Mr. Hewson said that the police had signalled to him to come ashore and warned him to keep his .22 rifle in the air, unloaded, and only to shoot when it was safe. They had gone to the south end of the island, followed by the protesters, who called him a bloody murderer and the lowest filth amongst other abuse. He loaded his rifle with the intention of shooting a seal pup when the gun was grabbed by Clive John Swinscoe, and 3 others then jumped in on top of him. One was Kevin Joseph Patrick Lee, and he put his arms around Mr. Hewison, causing him to have a nosebleed. Kevin Lee's wife was also arrested. She'd put herself between the gun and the seals, which was, as it were, the plan. And then it says here, Mr. Hewison said that he shot the seals as part of his livelihood and had been agitated by the incidents. European Director of the Sea Shepherd Conservation Group, Dave McCall, who organised the trip to Orkneys, said that there had been rumours that seals were being culled on out-of-bounds islands illegally, and the group formed a policy of direct action tactics, including spraying seals with dye. He said that all members of the group were against any sort of violence and would not use abusive language. He found the charges hard to believe. That was a subsequent court case. He said about 7 arrests, as I said, confrontation with the sealers. So I don't really know how accurate this report is, because I wasn't actually involved with these confrontations. because I was involved with being on the boats. For the rest of the time, when we arrived in Orkneys, Sea Shepherd had rented out 2 small cottages and also an office in a hotel for the duration. This here is Mick Heslin and myself in one of the cottages. So the party was split up as follows. We had 2 or maybe 3 groups who would set up camps on uninhabited islands, which were suspected to be where the seal killers would land. So that was one of the main plans. We did a seal demo in Toronto and the NP's office recently. No response, but fake blood poured in front. Not sure if you know Jerry and Peter McQueen. No, I don't actually know them. No, I don't. Okay, so as I said, I wasn't involved in that confrontation. I was part of the Sea Rider crew. So our job really was to ferry people and supplies around during the kind of operation. The captain of one of the Sea Riders was an experienced seafarer. I was trying to think of his name and I can't think of it. I think it's James something, but I'm not sure. But he was experienced because he used to be part of Greenpeace International before he got involved with Sea Shepherd. Now, the Scotsman, which published a special mag 1 year later, a glossy mag to go with their paper, reported that I had no experience of sailing, but I was learning fast. So that was our job, really, to kind of ferry people and supplies around, because obviously when we got reports about where the sealers had been, then the camps had to move around as well. So one time when we were out at sea, we discovered that we had been sabotaged. So it transpired that the seal killers, or somebody acting on their behalf at least, had sabotaged one of the Sea Riders by putting salt in the petrol tanks. And so that meant that the engines conked out and we broke down at sea. It was a bit dusky at the time and we could see a distant island. And so we resorted to rowing there. We got there, but it was dark by the time we arrived. Somebody on the boat worked out that this island was one of the ones which already had a Sea Shepherd camp on it. But we had a problem in the sense that we couldn't land the boat because of the jagged rocks. And also it's pitch black now. And so we had a real kind of problem. So we decided to split up and some people went off to the camp to try and get people to come back. And the idea was then to lift, with a lot of people, lift the boat over the rocks onto the sand. That was the plan. So while they'd gone, myself and this guy called Jerry from Manchester, we waited with the boat. Essentially, that meant that we were holding the boat out from the rocks. And then sadly, unexpectedly, Jerry got hypothermia. And we had no kind of choice really, but we had to get him into the Sea Rider. And he was really kind of shaking and stuff. And so I got in as well to the Sea Rider. And then I tried to kind of cuddle him to try and warm him up and this kind of stuff. But then I realized that the Sea Rider had drifted back out to sea. You could just tell by the stars that we're moving again, as it were. And so I had to abandon Jerry and jump back into the water and guide the boat back to close to the rocks where it was in the first place. Managed to get it back into position. And then the only other thing I remember there was some of the adult seals decided to play games with us. For example, I was up to my chest in water and suddenly a seal would pop a head out of the water and kind of spit water at us and then dive again. When they were on land, they weren't very agile, as you can imagine, but when they're in the sea, it's absolutely amazing to see them darting around and changing direction and all that. Obviously, that's their element. So they were playing around with me a little bit. So I'm going to bring this back in to there, I think. Okay. So the help returned, but by this time it was starting to get light enough to see what was going on. This is a picture of the Sea Rider has been pulled up over the rocks and out of the way of the tide. So even if the tide comes in, the Sea Rider would be safe. Interesting, actually, because I think this kind of safe area was pretty close to where the rocks were, but we couldn't see. So it would have probably been quite easy to have landed if we'd have only known, but we didn't know at the time. So there's nothing we could do. So obviously, in terms of what was going on, Jerry became our main concern. He was in a real state at this time. He was shaking, blubbering a little bit, but he couldn't really walk. We had to frog march him to the camp. Are we allowed to say frog march? Anyway, he was in quite a mess. And the other complication was that from where the boat was to where the camp was, there was 3 locked gates and fencing. And the gates were chained. And then the only thing we could do with Jerry, because he was a dead weight at this time, is we had to kind of just throw him over the other side of the fences and then climb over and pick him back up again. We had to do that 3 times. He was in a bad way by the time we got him to the camp, as you can imagine. Once we got him to the camp, clothes were taken off him and he got put into a very large sleeping bag. And 2 people joined him in there just to warm him up. And so then emergency flares were set off and the lifeboat eventually came out and we were taken back to Kirkwall, the capital. By the time we got back, a few of us were told that we would actually have to go back out again. And the reason for that is that the weather had deteriorated badly and was expected to get worse. This is the Beaufort wind scale. So we were told that the camps were going to be subject to these Beaufort wind scales of 10, 11, and 12. So these are things like storms, violent storms, and then hurricane force. This meant very, very high winds and massive waves. One of the camps kind of situated in tents within a broken down cottage. But really, we're just talking about just the walls left and no roof. And so there was a real concern that the walls would collapse onto the tents. We thought we were going to have to go and rescue the people. And as I said, I think it was the only camp left. I think others have either been moved, returned, or been arrested. So we made them a priority. There was a North American journalist who was part of the adventure called Mary Bloom, and she arranged with her editor to hire a fishing trawler and its crew to go back out. So this is a picture here with Mary Bloom in the middle. I'm the next one along with the hat. Well, there's 2 people with a hat and the one with the beard. And then the confusion here is the fact that I think this might have been the trawler going out to the island. The confusion for me is that the person at the end, I think, is Dave Callender. Now, Dave Callender was on the island. So there's obviously a kind of juxtaposition with regard to the photographs and the events. So by the time we get to the island, the seas are getting pretty rough. So what happens then is the trawler makes a lee, maneuvers itself to create a kind of calm area between itself and the shore, because the trawler itself can't land. We get to the camp and tell the people there what the problem is. They've been advised that they've got to leave, and they refuse to leave. They said, but we're expecting the sealers the following day. We'll risk it for a vegan biscuit. They didn't say. We just had to say, okay, well, your choice on that. And so we just sailed away again, but we decided to rescue the Sea Rider on the way back. And once we'd got the Sea Rider, then it was back to Kirkwall once more and the capital. Roger walks the talk. Well, I'm not trying to make it dramatic. I'm just kind of telling you what it was. Actually, one of the scariest bits is now in the sense that we were going back. The storm was getting worse and worse, and we were getting thrown around quite a lot. But we had the Sea Rider on tow. So some of us were at the back of the trawler trying to ensure that the Sea Rider didn't, the rope and everything wouldn't snap. But the problem was that the sea was so bad that 1 minute the Sea Rider would be kind of towering above you, and then the next second it would be below you. And then sometimes the rope would go slack. And then when the boats came together again, it would kind of thwack. It was pretty dangerous. So much so that in the end, the captain of the trawler said to us, you need to get into the galley, which is at the front of the boat, and just leave the Sea Rider. And if it goes, it goes. Nothing we can do about it. And so that's what we decided to do. The only memory of the galley that I had was there was a stove in there, which was lit and everything. And one big wave hit us, and I was thrown backwards onto the stove, and all my coat started sizzling and stuff, and I rolled off and all this kind of stuff. That was the scariest bit. It wasn't the police, it was the weather, essentially. So eventually we get back, and Dave McCall had arranged for the Sea Rider to go to a ship's chandler, a place to be cleaned of the salt. Because of the fact that the salt was put into the fuel tanks, it meant that the salt was everywhere, all the piping into the engine and everything else. So that really meant that the Sea Rider would have to be virtually taken apart, and that would take all night. but they decided that they would do that. And the guy called in his entire team of mechanics, and they worked all night to do this job. The guy that I said was a experienced seafarer is in this picture. He's the guy on the left. I'm the one in the middle. You can tell he's a seafarer because he's got a roller neck jumper. So we just had to wait until next morning. And I do remember that Dave McCall was getting a bit agitated about the money situation at this stage. He didn't know if he was going to have enough to pay for the repair, especially if there were several mechanics working all the way through the night. So we kind of timidly went down in the morning to find out what the score was, as it were. They refused payment. They said, no, here's the boat. It's all free. Dave went scuttling back to his old hotel. And for some reason, he had a big crate of Scottish whiskey in the hotel room, I think to kind of give to journalists during press conferences and stuff. I think that's what the official thing was. And so we took several bottles of that back to the shipyard. We gave them out to him. So the boat was back in working order. And so then we were able to do things like get equipment and all the rest of it. But essentially, that's kind of the end of the story, really. A few people had been arrested and then bailed. We had the boat that was broken down and then recovered. And luckily, we didn't have to pay too much. So that's the end of the story, apart from this, which is a picture of us sabbing a hunt on the way back to Glasgow. The guy on the left, that's Clive Swinscoe from that story. I'm the one at the top in the red. Dave Callan just below me, Mick to his right. No, left, right. I'm bad at that. Okay, so Clive knew all the hunts in Scotland, and so he knew which hunt would be out that day. And so we did a sab on the way back. Clive was also, in fact, if you could see a big picture of that, you can see he's got binoculars. He was a big bird watcher. He would stop us every now and again. The Land Rover would screech to a halt, and he'd go, "Oh, I've just seen X, rare bird," and we had to then stay there for 40 minutes while Clive did his thing. It took us a while to get back, I suppose. Right, so that's the end of all this, except for this. So these are the guys, the guys and gals, the lads and lasses who caused all the trouble. So here is a grey seal pup. Can we put that message back up? I didn't see it. You paid them with, yeah, we probably did. I think, to be honest, on the grounds that they were living on the Orkneys, there was no trees on the Orkneys because the wind was so ferocious that there was no trees. And I think there might be kind of bushes or, very kind of little ones, which tended to be all bent over and everything, but there was no kind of forest or anything like that. So fascinating overview.